This module we will actually start taking a look at the penetration testing concepts and what kind of techniques are generally done, including the different steps that one does as part of penetration testing. So, there are actually different terms that are typically used by an organization. You will find a term called as security audit or a network or a risk assessment, as well as penetration testing being used in an interchangeable form. But if you strictly see, there are very subtle differences between these terms, and we should be little bit careful on what term will be more appropriate for a given context. So, when you look at a security audit, it basically means to do a sort of a measurable technical assessment of a system or an application, right. So, what do we mean by a technical assessment here is with respect to the security part of it, how a system or an application is secure enough, or whether there are any specific things that needs to be further enhanced to take care of the fact that the security has to be strengthened as far as that particular system or application is concerned. So, the next is basically the network assessment, where it is more an evaluation of risks or vulnerabilities detecting in systems or applications or processes, right. So, here the question of risk or vulnerability measurement is typically done to ensure that I have some sort of an analysis done subsequently on that vulnerability that has been found out and how to address it subsequently. So, the network assessment part of it comes more from the perspective of trying to find out what kind of security issues that needs to be addressed from a network point of view. The third one that we are going to be looking at more in detail as part of this particular course is about penetration testing, which really goes beyond a simple security audit or a network assessment, right. So, what it actually does is this basically tries to put one into the shoes of a potential hacker who might have a malicious intent and look at the entire system from his perspective, trying to identify and attack what possible vulnerabilities are present in the system at that instant of time, right. So, among the three, as we can very clearly see, penetration testing is something which is more involved, more important from the perspective of ensuring that the security is assessed up to the maximum possible extent of a system or an application. So, what kind of things do we do in a penetration testing? We actually would attempt to verify which vulnerabilities are genuine, right. So, while we could find out the initial list of vulnerabilities, what will typically happen is that some of the vulnerabilities would not really turn out to be a security issue, but it would be turning out to be what we refer to as a false positive, wherein the issue would not be as it is claimed to be, but it would have been because of the fact that at that particular instant of time possibly it was acting as a vulnerability, right. So, there is a differentiation of all the vulnerabilities that are identified between real positive and a false positive, wherein the real positive ones are the ones that needs to be looked at from the perspective of trying to have an addressal done for them, whereas the false positives are sort of ignored at this point in time because of the fact that it is not really considered to be a very serious issue. So, effective penetration test basically target a specific system with a specific goal. So, the system here could be a standalone system, or it could be one part of the network as well, and the goal will be very specific, saying that I want to find out what kind of security issues are present in that particular system or in that part of the network, or how could a potential hacker bring down a system or bring down that part of the network. So, essentially since the penetration testing actually tries to simulate what a malicious hacker from outside the network would possibly end up doing, you will find that the goals have to be very clearly specified for the entire testing effort to be very effective. The next point that we will have to consider here is quality of the test cases that we are attempting to do as far as penetration testing is concerned is very important as compared to quantity. So, it does not really matter whether I have actually run 100 different test cases, but if all those 100 cases have actually been not capable of having unearthed some kind of vulnerabilities or potential hacking entry points into my system or my network, that will be considered typically by the customer as sort of pretty much useless set of effort, whereas if even if 5 or 10 test cases have actually been covered and all of them have actually either proved that the security is very good or it has actually exposed a sort of a loophole which the hacker could potentially leverage, then that also would be more than sufficient as far as the completeness of the penetration testing effort is concerned. So, it is very important to note here that the quality is more important than the quantity of the test cases that has actually been run. So, by carefully choosing valuable targets, a penetration tester can determine the entire security infrastructure and associated risk for a valuable asset. So, as we will be seeing subsequently in the course, it becomes very imperative that the identification of the potential targets which the penetration tester should possibly use as an entry point into the system or into the network should be very carefully selected in order to ensure that the returns on the time and the effort that the penetration tester is going to be actually employing is maximum, right. So, if I basically try to have a good set of targets that I have actually selected as a penetration tester, I would possibly able to prove lot of targets loopholes that is present in the system or in the network very easily as compared to not selecting the appropriate target initially, right, wherein I run the risk of not being able to have the all the loopholes extracted out, or I would possibly be taking much more time than what should I have actually spent as a penetration tester to detect those loopholes if I have not selected the targets correctly initially, right. One of the most common myths that actually is circulating around in the entire industry is that if I do penetration testing, I can sort of assume that my network is secure, right. So, there cannot be a bigger myth than this, because doing penetration testing and identifying the results out of the testing, whether it is telling you that all the test cases is actually passed, meaning that there are no vulnerabilities, or telling you that there are 2 vulnerabilities out of possible 10 vulnerabilities that is there as part of the test cases, is only a sampling that has actually been done, right. So, we will need to essentially understand that it is going to be very critical that not to have an opinion that having done penetration testing, we cannot really rest on a laurel that our network has become very secure, because it basically only evaluates the effectiveness of the existing security on a auditing basis. So, I could potentially have certain things which should not have, which possibly has not been evaluated by the penetration tester, or some things could have actually changed in my environment or in my settings after I have done the penetration testing, which could have actually opened up a loophole for hackers to get inside, and there are so many other possibilities that is there. And the second important point is that the penetration testing should be done only after the customer has exhausted all efforts for securing the system, right. So, for example, if the customer has just about brought up a network and he has just connected a router, he has basically connected a set of devices into the router device and sort of built up the network, it is actually not of any use if the first task that the customer tries to basically do is hire a professional person to do a penetration testing on it, right. Because there has been no security related checkpoints that has actually been put into the network or in its entire IT infrastructure for having any fruitful results of penetration testing. So, essentially there has to be a firewall minimally, right, there has to be some sort of malware protection softwares and so on and so forth. Only after the basic things has actually been sanitized and the customer has sort of thought through from his level and from his point of view what kind of checkpoints he has to put for protecting the entire network security, he should basically go ahead with trying to have the penetration testing effort started, right. And then the next point that we will have to also consider, which is often not given the due importance, is that the scope of work for the penetration testing should define what exactly what systems, what applications running on those systems, and what part of the networks are going to be targeted as part of doing this penetration testing, because otherwise it would basically be an exercise without a focus or without any kind of specific targeted goal. So, that is again another thing that needs to be considered very seriously. So, over the next few sessions what we are going to be actually ending up doing is that we will try to answer and learn a lot about the following questions. How should the possible targets be researched? So, how do I identify what is an ideal target for a penetration testing to be done on a system or on a network? How to identify potential vulnerabilities in the different types of applications or different type of systems that I have actually targeted out of my first step. How to defend the applications against the common attacks. So, having identified the targets, having identified what kind of vulnerabilities are existing on those identified targets, what is the steps that I need to take to sort of defend and sort of protect those vulnerabilities. So, it could be either a patch for that application, or it could be a patch on the operating system that I am running on the target, or it could be a patch on my router device, depending on what exactly the system or what part of my network or which application that I have actually found a vulnerability on my target device, right. And then how can I basically offer a complete suite of penetration testing services to a potential customer who might be interested in ensuring that his entire system or network needs to be protected on a continuous basis. So, we will actually take an example of a web application to discuss about the penetration testing concept. So, web application, as we all would be knowing by now, is basically an application that actually has two parts, one which is the client and another which is the server. So, my web browser that I am running on my side of the entire path is basically going to be the web browser. So, that is going to be my web client. It will basically try to contact a server for which I am basically trying to connect from my web browser as a client and try to get some data or get some service done, right. So, essentially it is going to be a web browser communicating to a web server on a remote site and trying to get some data or executing some service as appropriate for the application that we are trying to. So, it could vary from a very simple messaging application to something like a storage provider on a cloud. So, the application of the web that we are actually talking about could vary in terms of simplicity and complexity on both extremes. So, it could be as simple as a small messaging application, or it could be a very complicated application also trying to do lot of things that in one application, right. So, access to these applications would typically be through an industry standard web browser. So, some of the most common web browsers that we actually make use of are, as we all know, is Internet Explorer, Firefox, Chrome, Safari and so on, but being most common popular application browsers also has advantages and disadvantages. So, advantages here would essentially mean that in terms of the installation and in terms of the wide range of support, we would actually tend to get very good very quick feedback and very good support as well. But in terms of disadvantages, it also would essentially mean that for an hacker, as long as he knows that these are the standard set of browsers that is going to be used for this web application, there are already an existing set of vulnerabilities that are available for those standard web browsers and specifically for each of those browser versions as well, right, which could potentially be very quickly leveraged by the hacker. So, for example, if I know that a particular web application is going to be supported by, let us say, an IE version X, right. I know from other sources what are the potential vulnerabilities that are existing when I use IE version 6 as a browser client software for running any kind of a web application. So, the hacker would immediately try to test out whether those vulnerabilities are potentially could be made use of for compromising that particular web application server, right. So first and foremost, how will the hacker know which browser clients work for a particular server, web application server? You will find that most of the applications, web applications, basically print in their home page itself what is the best browser client software versions that is actually working very well with that particular server, right. So this is a very easy set of information that a hacker could potentially be leveraging on to find out first and foremost what is the web browser client software that he should basically need to target on, right. Even on all the smart-held devices like your smartphones or your tablet devices, you find most of them today are web applications that is actually running, but the browsers running on the smartphone devices or your handheld devices are slightly different versions as compared to what you have on your desktops or on your servers, right. They are actually modified versions of the standard browser versions that are available on the normal desktop PCs, but it is suffice to note here that those modified versions also has documented set of vulnerabilities that you can very easily lay your hands on to get details. So in terms of the scope of a web application penetration testing, some non-technical areas that one should basically take care of is about acquisition mechanisms of devices by the users. So other than the normal typical usage, how are the devices going to be used after acquiring them by the users. So for example, if a network is going to be consisting of devices, let us say a smart tablet devices the users are going to be making use of, so we will also have to take note as part of the penetration testing of where those devices are going to be made use of by the user. So for example, will the user take the device out from the premises to their, let us say, to their homes and also operate the same device from the network there, right. So in that case we will actually have to have mechanisms to ensure that certain types of applications do not run on the devices when it is actually taken out of the premises and then used outside the premises, right. So in that way we will also need to have details about how and where the devices are also going to be made use of. So possible uses of device usage other than this particular application that is being targeted for penetration testing, what kind of other usages that this particular device is going to be put into use for, and then what kind of maintenance policies that are there of the server or the network if the scope of the penetration testing is covering them, right. So when the maintenance testing is being done, when the maintenance is actually being done on that particular server or on the network, what kind of things are going to be done which could potentially expose a vulnerability or introduce a new vulnerability after this particular penetration testing effort has actually been completed. So in terms of methodology, you actually have different types of penetration testing. You have a black box testing, white box testing, and a blend between black box and white box testing called as a gray box testing that is there. So when you talk of black box testing, the penetration tester will not actually have any idea of the target network or the company processes or the services, right. So the entire the system, the entire the topology, so to say, will be a complete black hole for him, wherein because of the fact that he does not have any detail at all about it, he would require a lot of reconnaissance that has to be done, right. So subsequently in our later sessions we are going to look at in great detail about what reconnaissance is all about and what kind of techniques are generally adopted to find out details about the entire system and what is the methodology by which you can get the complete details. But essentially in the black box testing, because of the fact that the tester is not going to have any details about what he is being given as a target for testing, there is a lot of effort and time that a hacker has to actually put in before the platform is there for him to actually launch the attacks finally, right. So in that sense a black box testing for a hacker would actually turn out to be ending up having a requirement to spend a lot of time for him to finally complete and sort of achieve his objective of attacking the intended targets. So, in this case he does not have any detail at all whatsoever about the entire system, about the entire network, and he is just told that this particular set of things has to be attacked, and ask him to see whether how successful he is in doing the attack. So, as compared to white box testing, where the tester has actually got a very intricate knowledge of the entire system. The tester is also provided with lot of details about the system, about the network topology. So, what kind of company security processes are there, what kind of operating systems are running on the servers, and so on and so forth, right. So, there is very little detail that a white box penetration tester need to sort of find it very hard to get it, because all the things are provided, all the details are provided to him on a platter, and then he is basically asked to only do the testing from the perspective of what kind of vulnerabilities are possible given all these details to him, right. So, this is not typically done by somebody outside the system, but this kind of white box penetration testing is done typically by the security team that is possibly there inside the organization, and this will actually be done very periodically, much more periodically as compared to, let us say, doing a black box testing from outside. So, in between black box and white box testing, you have a grey box testing, where the customer or the owner will feel that some part of the information that has not been disclosed publicly could potentially be made available, will possibly be detected by the penetration tester, and therefore tells one part of the entire system or the network, or one part of the application, whichever is the target that is being tested right now, need not be tested at all. So, that basically gets removed from the scope of the testing. So, because of this particular detail, we cannot really call that the penetration tester is actually doing a black box testing, because some part has actually been explicitly told by the customer now that need not be tested. So, that means essentially the tester has been given some details indirectly about what is a portion of that particular target, right. And again, looking at it from another perspective, other than this portion that needs to be taken out of the scope, the tester does not have any other detail pertaining to the target under testing, right. So, from that perspective it turns out to be a black box. So, since it is partly a white box and partly a black box, this is the reason why something like this kind of a testing is referred to as a grey box testing, right. So, coming down to actually understanding who are the kind of people who will come and attack a system, right. So, the real attackers typically tend to have some kind of an information about a target before they make an attack, right. So, it could be very generic detail, or it could be a very specific detail also that could have been actually sourced through non-technical means, maybe through contacting a friend on the phone and trying to get some details on the phone, or contacting somebody over a cup of coffee in a coffee shop and getting some details, and so on and so forth, right. So, they will try to have some kind of information about a target before trying to start making the attacks, and attackers will specifically choose one single target at any point in time. So, if they know that for an organization a mail server, for example, is something which is very critical, that could potentially be the first entry point that they might try to target to gain entry into the entire network, or to sort of bring down the entire network in first shot itself, right. And from a personality point of view, we will always find that the real attackers are highly motivated and charged, okay, and this would be reflecting in them putting in some die-hard effort to ensure that they do not rest till they succeed in their mission of having a successful attack done on that potential target that has been identified. and then most of the times we will find that with the initial information that they have actually gathered through other non-technical means, the real attackers will try to start off do a grey box initially, but you will also find that when they are not being able to get the details from other non-technical means initially, the real attackers would also have enough motivation and enough charge in them to ensure that they actually spend all the time that is required to do black box testing, even by spending hours and hours in doing the initial reconnaissance. So, in terms of the scope contents for the penetration testing, initially the identification of the target system, then what kind of time frame will there be potentially required to be spent, and what will be the customer be willing to give them. So, what kind of targets and how to do an evaluation of them. So, and what kind of software and tools that they are going to use for penetration testing, right. So, one point that we will have to note here is that while intuitively we might find we might feel that the penetration testers will not basically disclose what kind of software and tools that they are using for penetration testing, you will find that the requirement for them to be making it public will be much more higher for the customers to get a confident feeling that yes, these reports that have been submitted finally by the tester can be taken at face value, right. So, you will find that the software, the tools, the versions also are explicitly mentioned and decided upfront by the penetration tester after the targets have been potentially identified. Then it also will basically talk about the stakeholders of this penetration testing and what kind of initial access level that will be provided to the tester. So, this will basically determine whether it is a full black box, full white box, or a sort of a grey box testing in the middle, right. So, target space definition in terms of what parts of the target is the testing to be done on the target, right. So, if I am going to be basically targeting a particular network, so should I basically concentrate on the core router, or should I concentrate on the entire set of routers that is there as part of the network, and so on and so forth, right. Similarly, if I am basically going to be given a target for a particular application, so should I be basically bothered and try to attack only having the application successfully authenticate me, or should I sort of go and attack till the application itself is brought down successfully by me as an unauthorized user, right. So, this is basically what we mean by a target space definition, right. So, what is the level of compromise of the target system and final deliverable from the penetration testing. So, all these will typically form part of my scope, right. So, in the subsequent sessions we will talk more about how penetration testing is done with the different kind of steps. Thank you.